Welcome to Cinema 4D. Today we're going to be going over the interface of Cinema 4D and how to work with it and how to feel comfortable with the interface. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at how to make a simple primitive. And if we hover over this, you can see it says cube, and this is where we can make all of our most basic, simple items. So I'm going to click and hold, and you can see we have a cube, plane, polygon, everything up from a figure and on up. So just like you can create simple items in Photoshop or Microsoft Word, this is the simplest items you can create in Cinema 4D. So I'm going to start off with a cube. And these are like the building blocks of everything you can create in Cinema 4D. There's more than one way to do anything within Cinema 4D, but it's good to start off with Cinema 4D primitives. So I'm going to start off by making a cube. Hovering over this, we have many items we can create here, but the cube is the simplest of them. So now that we have a cube made, let's take a look at some other things we can do within this first bar of tools in Cinema 4D. These tools are like splines in Photoshop or Illustrator, and we have many of them pre-built: an arc, helix, rectangle, and all of these other splines. So these can be used in other facets of Cinema 4D, but it's good just to know where they are. We then have a typography tool that we can create extruded text and spline-based text. I'm just going to be going over the basic tools right now, and as we get into Cinema 4D, we'll be going over more complex objects. But as you can see here, we have a camera tool where we can create a standard camera or a motion camera in more complex cameras. We also have lights that we can create, and these lights include omni lights that go in all directions. We have spotlights that can be focused on a particular item, subject, target lights that can follow a subject throughout the scene, and even more complex lights like area lights, PBR lights, ISE lights, infinite lights, and we'll be going over those more in the future. This is the camera tool where we can create a general camera, a targeted camera targeted to a subject, a stereo camera for 3D viewing, and more complex cameras. We can also create a sky, a floor, environments, and we'll be going over that more in the future. So let's start out by clicking on our cube, taking a look at that, and if we go under coordinates, if I come down to the attribute menu here, you'll see that I can take my cube and slide it in the X direction, horizontally, back and forth, using X, very similar to Photoshop or Illustrator. That's using the X transform. I'm clicking in the middle and dragging left and right. So now I am using my Y transform to make this go up and down. And then we have the last one, Z. And this is what makes this program different than Photoshop or Illustrator. We can transform this in the Z axis to have it go back and forward in space. Next, we have R. So these are for rotation. And H, P, and B stands for heading, pitch, and banking. But you might prefer to use X, Y, and Z. So we can rotate this on the X-axis, X-axis, Y-axis, and Z-axis. Notice that these are all color-coded. So I can see here, Z is blue, Y is green, and X is red. Next, we have scale. So I could scale this non-proportionally on the X-axis, on the Y-axis, and the Z-axis. So now you should feel comfortable about what coordinates control, how to control them, and how to change it if you prefer from HPB, heading, pitch, and banking, to X, Y, and Z if you feel more comfortable with that. This is how to move your object around the three-dimensional space, how to rotate it, and how to scale it. Now that we've gone over coordinates, let's go over objects. So this controls the object size, how large it's going to be on the x-axis, y-axis, z-axis, as well as how many segments is the subject made up of. The more segments this subject is made up with, the more lines this is made up at, the more lines that are contained in your shape controls how much you can edit this subject currently and in the future. So we can put lines on the X, Y, and Z. And in the future, we'll be able to control these individually by changing this into a polygon and editing the points, edges, and faces of this particular polygon when we go ahead and do that conversion. Right now, it's still a primitive. We can also control the fillet of the object by pressing this button. And by increasing the fillet, I can make this rounder or very sharp. I recommend that everything contains a small fillet, even if it's the smallest amount, and that'll make it look more realistic in the three-dimensional space and make it more realistic when you light the subject, because it'll have edges for the light to reflect off of. As I increase this fillet, you'll notice that I am able to add additional subdivisions to this object, and that will give it more of a realistic look. If we zoom into it, it will look less faceted when rendered, but we don't want to give too many facets, so it slows down the render process. So it's always a balance of the two. Now that we've gone over that, let's take a look at how to orbit and how to change your default camera view. Now we'll look into how to change and manipulate your 3D camera view. So I recommend that you write this down and practice it over and over until it becomes muscle memory. The first thing we're going to do is hold down Option or Alt on a PC and click with our left mouse button. And this is controlling the default camera. It's not moving the object. It's just controlling how our default camera is looking at the object. So I just recommend that you practice it until it becomes second nature. So again, Option or Alt on a PC, left mouse button allows us to orbit around wherever we place our mouse and press our left mouse button. All right, number 2 is Option or Alt, middle mouse button, and that will allow us to pan back and forth over our object. Pan. So that's Option, middle mouse button. Very similar how you would use the hand tool or space bar in Photoshop or Illustrator. And the third is Option, Alt, or Alt, right mouse button. It allows us to dolly in and out, so zoom our camera into the subject or out of the subject. Notice that the subject's size is staying the same under its object property. However, we're just walking in or zooming in, not zooming, we're moving the camera closer to the object, and the object size is staying the same.
E is for move, baby, groove to the beat. R is rotate, let's get up off our seat. T is the transform, take it from 0. Mouse buttons press where geometry heroes. Left is for orbit, let your world spin around. Middle for pan, sweeping up and down. Right button zoom,
So now we've taken a look at the object, we've gone over the attributes of the object, coordinates, which is transforms the size, controls the rotation, and controls the scale. Coordinates, that controls the position, the rotation, and the scale. If you ever forget, you can look right next to them. You'll see you'll see P for position, R for rotation, S for scale. And next we went over object, and that controls the size of the object and the X, Y, and Z position, the segments, and the fillet of the object. So let's also discuss how to move the object around. And we're going to do that. So I recommend remembering this. 3 buttons. The first is E. By pressing E, notice that the move mode becomes activated. And now we can move this object on the Z-axis, the Y-axis, and the X-axis. All of those color codes are right here. And the important thing is to remember to always, unlike Photoshop or Illustrator, always move the objects by either going into the attributes menu or touching on these particular handles and moving the object around. If you don't do that, you're going to be moving the item in ways that you weren't cognizant of because this program works different than Photoshop. So again, that's E for move. And notice that these E, R, and T buttons are right next to each other on the keyboard. So what I do is I hover my fingers over these 3 buttons so I can go from E to move. And now let's look at R. R for rotation. So I can control that by hovering over one of these bands and click and drag my left mouse button to rotate. What I like to do is hold down the Shift button, and that will allow me to rotate in 5-degree increments. So I start moving, and then I press Shift, and look at that. Now I'm moving in 5-degree increments, and I recommend that you start off doing this so you can have absolute control when moving the items around, and that you can also, if you choose to do a 90-degree rotation, it'll be very easy to do. So that's E for move, R for rotation, and the last one is T for scale. The weird thing about T is that I recommend when you press T to activate, notice that these 3 things would be activated over here: move, rotate, scale. And when you do this, click outside of the object, not in the subject, but outside, click and drag. And we can proportionally scale our item up and down. As opposed to scaling them on one axis, we're proportionally scaling this. And that's very helpful. If you want to disproportionately scale, you can always click on these yellow dots. And I can scale on the Z-axis, and I know it's Z by looking up here, and I see Z is on the Z-axis. Z is for scaling on Z, or green, that's scaling on the Y-axis. Red is scaling on the X-axis. So I'm unlike Photoshop, or I need to make sure that I'm pressing on what I would like to alter and press on that exact thing and not just press anywhere, which would give very inconsistent results in Cinema 4D. So we also have another way to control Cinema 4D. There's more than one way to do anything. We can use the 1 key. By pressing and holding on the 1 key, I can move back and forth. 2 key, I can zoom in and out. And 3 key, I can orbit. I prefer to use my Option, left, middle, and right mouse button, but if you're on it and you don't have a mouse, feel free to use the 1, 2, and 3 keys. The last method of moving around would be these simple buttons up here. If you go into a studio, you won't see them using these because this is like for a novice. I recommend that you don't use these, but if you forget how to do something, you can use these buttons. Press the hand to move. Press this to dolly in and out. And this button, click and drag to rotate. The last button we're going to use is this button. So this is important to see where your object is in three-dimensional space. It is the toggle active view button. And once I press it, you'll see that we can see many different views of this object in Cinema 4D. The first is perspective. This is our default camera, and I can still option left, middle, and right click on this object. By the way, you can see that this is currently doing a simple render. I can alter this by going under display, garage shading with lines, or if I don't want to see those lines, I could do a quick shading. So the secret buttons for those are N, A. I'm pressing N and A to see garage shading, or N and B to see the lines. So I'm just quickly pressing N, quickly pressing B, letting up on those, and I can change how this is viewed in our perspective view. So here I'm going to come over to top view. So this is a default orthographic, meaning one view looking from the top down. I'm going to press NB, or look at, if you're interested in learning more options, press N, and you can see all of the additional ways that you can view this by pressing different values. I'm going to press B